Hey y'all, this is Andy from Ant Panda. We're going to talk about the introductions of Resident Evil, and in my opinion, the way it was introduced, the way it was released in the US is probably the greatest introductions in a video games of all time. Let's go through each portion of it. I can tell you each why I believe it is, because in many ways it does a lot of things that I don't think it was intentionally supposed to be doing, that it does really well in order to incorporate the immersion and the amazingness and also proper timing of the survival horror genre of Resident Evil. So let's begin and let's look at some of the things that come with the introduction of Resident Evil when it came out. Story time. 1996 in the US. Resident Evil is actually released and put on shelves in every electronics boutique around the world. And the interesting thing is the front cover of the game shows obviously a very fearful, very exhausted, very intense military man, probably cornered in some section with a massive weapon, looking in complete awe and fear for something you can't even see off the photo. He's looking straight into it. Now, obviously, there's some other silhouettes of some crows, spiders, and whatnot, but to a typical viewer, especially myself at the time, where I was about 11, 12, 13 years old, was unbeknownst to know that. I was just looking at the cover of a game that is called Resident Evil. As a kid at this time, I don't know what Resident Evil actually meant, nor did I know what this individual was looking at. And I'll even be first to admit that I didn't even really read pretty hard into the back cover of Resident Evil at the time. During this time, the PlayStation 1 is in its prime. Electronics boutique and the internet, of course, didn't really exist the way it does now. So purchasing games, you would go to either a mall or you'd go to a standalone if you had it. But in my case, up north of the United States, we had a mall that had all of our stores in it, and Electronics Boutique was in a corner of a particular section with 2 TV screens and had every hot new release for any sort of consoles or video games that came out. And Resident Evil was on the shelf towards the tippy top, of course, for those mature adult viewers, where kids and children, myself, wouldn't really look for it. My father purchased the game and brought it home mainly because of pure interest and pure hearsay and referral of this game being one of the greatest to play, but also very difficult to play and challenging is what made it even more appealing at the time. I remember as a kid watching and looking at Resident Evil when it was first brought up. I still didn't really understand at the time the title of it, what it meant, or anything related to do what Resident Evil actually was, other than the fact that it just looked like an adult type of game that had weapons and either some form of terror that had to actually be extinguished. Let's go ahead and look at each section of this intro theme by theme. When my dad first brought this up, it was very interesting because it also kind of made me pay attention more to the sound effects. Most notably, the first portion was the PlayStation 1 theme. Whenever you would hear it, you would just hear this kind of bass type sound that would come in the beginning. And then kind of give you a nice little jingle that kind of made you feel a little bit safe and secure in the midst of it. Ending with a long kind of, low tone echo that did give a little bit of unsettledness to it, which is what really made any sort of PlayStation 1 themed game kind of make you question of which one it was. Because every single one of these had this intro theme. You could never determine or figure out it because it was the same for each and every one. So it always brought up a little bit first level of immersion with a little bit of a question mark because you wasn't exactly sure what particular game was coming in and what was going to be booting up next. And a lot of times it had a pause of a few to several seconds in order to actually move to the next portion. The Capcom theme, I would almost say, is like the second level of immersion, which I don't know if they necessarily did this on purpose, but basically kind of showing the Capcom theme being carved out of a, sort of golden and brass piece with kind of a build-up that basically brought it all the way up to showing the Capcom words towards the end, almost like a stepping stone kind of setup all the way towards the end that made you feel a little bit secure in knowing the fact that Capcom was there and it was created, but at the same time knowing the franchises, and especially my young age, that the only thing that I know that they created was Resident Evil or Street Fighter. And if we were on a PlayStation game, it wasn't really going to be, at least at the time around 96, it wasn't going to be a Street Fighter game. It was going to be a mature-rated Resident Evil game. And this in itself kind of brought me deeper into the immersion of seeing this intro theme as it continues. And then the next level with Resident Evil itself. Most folks, at least for the first time, including myself as a child, would wait to see the demo. And in this case, it wasn't a demo. Looking down a scary hall in the sense of it being dark, showing the camera of something sinister running towards a man that was looking to walk away, and exploring in that particular hallway, with the ominous background noise of terror that kind of came out of that tone as it went towards the individual. And then having the gentleman, which actually was, I'm pretty sure, played by Chris Redfield in the character, looking straight at the screen with the biggest eyes ever and then screaming. But it doesn't hit home until it then transitions into the splash of blood that then it cuts to, not showing him at all, but then right afterwards showing right into his face, specifically into his eyeball, with it freeze screening and then echoing of his intense screams that were being brought of that introduction. It was one of those things that never kind of left my mind when I heard it and saw it. It was one of those where I knew that if I ever heard this again going into the future after the first time, this was going to be a Resident Evil game. And this game was going to be intense and life-changing in the sense of this is a mature-rated game with death, killing, terror, and fear. At this particular point, when you look at the menu and it's only got two options of new game and load game, there's not much for you to do. So a lot of times as a child of this young, getting into this game the first time, you then hit the new game portion and then you heard Resident Evil. With this particular thing in mind, it kind of brings you out a little bit. It's almost like the undertone and the intensity of the fear of the introduction before this word was mentioned or the title just kind of makes it a little bit more, not necessarily comedic, but lighthearted when Resident Evil is read across the words. Now, the red outline and wording definitely with the shadows goes with the undertone of the previous fear-inducing scream and blood splattering, but the actual voice line of Resident Evil, it just kind of didn't really instill the fear, at least the first or second time. And eventually it kind of would as that ongoing theme when you would see it over and over again in the future games. It definitely instilled more and more to it. Then we're going to go into the fourth level of immersion, and that is when it shows the ability for you to pick and choose the ID of two officers, either Jill Valentine and Chris. Now, because of the fact this would be my first time actually playing the game, and I remember distinctly, and also because of the fact that I'm a, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old, 90s action stars were, of course, a thing. I mean, Die Hard, Terminator, all of them. You always wanted to end up picking the, masculine, intense action hero, and that's why I believe in the playthrough of my first one, it was always with Chris Redfield. And then once the selection for the ID was made, it just definitely made it level set and hard with that selection. So continuing with this level of immersion in the game, it then kind of shows that in the near future, in a forest, raccoon forest specifically, there is going to be an incident involving something. It was all black and white, trees, clouds, and then you start listening to the ominous voice, what you believe is going to probably be the same voice as Chris Redfield talking about the bizarre murders that occurred. The interesting part is this. During this transition, when it would show the newspapers, it kind of made the terror ever so real out of the entire cutscene, as it shows the bizarre murders occurring, even though it was sometimes misspelled. But it had black and white photos, it had a lot of description, and stars were to save. But the most influential part of this, not just the newspaper clippings, but also the little
of families being attacked
pew drop, of the background to instill terror, was actually quite moving as a special effect and music honest. This in itself kind of made you think, well, this could be honestly realistic when you compare the time, the realistic video, the clippings, and then of course the fearful background noise in music.
Alpha Team is flying around the forest zone situated in northwest Raccoon City, where we're searching for the helicopter of our compatriots Bravo Team, who disappeared during the middle of our mission.
You haven't found it?
No, I haven't found it yet. Bizarre murder cases have recently occurred in Raccoon City. There are outlandish reports of families being attacked by a group of about 10 people. Victims were apparently eaten. Bravo Team went to the hideout of the group and disappeared.
And then of course we move on to the scene where the Alpha Team is looking for Bravo teams and they find the helicopter, and then it actually clearly shows all the individuals there.
It was Bravo Team's helicopter. Nobody was in it. But strangely, most of the equipment was still there. However, we soon discovered why.
Even though for the fact they just landed, it looks like the Alpha Team is actually there and have been there for a while, dealing with the elements and the darkness and the intense fear and terror of all the things that were building up to it, especially with the different facial expressions with it being in black and white. Showing Joseph then to actually find a weapon with the buildup of the sound effects and stingers, and then of course his face in itself is actually the thing that carried the fear and terror from the cutscene more.
Hey! Come here!
So at the time, I didn't think much of the weapon other than the expression that was on Joseph's face. And then of course the dogs came in. Being this young in my first kind of introduction in video games, especially FMVs, these dogs actually were pretty frightening. It wasn't the sense of the dogs itself, but it was the grotesque sound effects of the terror that they ensued with their growling, and then the munching of flesh and bone of Joseph as he's screaming. Having all of those things together this early on with PlayStation and games in general, I will say instilled probably my first nightmare in combination with the hallway scene of Resident Evil in the future, but we'll dive into that in a bit. Once seeing that and then seeing everyone else jump into action with Jill screaming, which unfortunately with Jill screaming kind of takes you out of it for a second, but then weapons start discharging.
Joseph!
it then kind of brings you back home as far as the intensity, the fear, and the terror that's coming with it. And them running and trying to get to the helicopter, which of course then the scene with Chris reaching out and saying,
No! Don't go!
does also bring you out of the scene a little bit. Me as a kid, I always thought that was kind of an odd one, but I wasn't one to critique, mainly because I wasn't generally a cinematic student, nor did I really look at movies other than just pure entertainment, and didn't really critique a lot of the cinematography and the way it was shot. So even though that kind of did bring me out of it, it was one of those things where ultimately it didn't kill my immersion for the game. Of course, then as they start running and then you start hearing them kind of breathing heavy and running through all of the tall grass and then discharging their weapons with Chris.
Jill, run for that house!
It definitely brought me a bit of intensity that I was not expecting as the first introduction for Resident Evil for me as a kid. And then we go to the character introduction screen.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.
Which, for all intensive purposes, all the rules and established physics in the world today, this completely came left field when it started announcing the cast. But as a kid and seeing this the first time, I understood this is their way of introducing the characters in a way that makes it so it brings them out of the realm to say, hey, here's what you got. Better remember these faces because you're going to see them again, but know that they're actors in the world of Resident Evil. And at the time, of course, I thought it was all consistent in the way it was shot and done, seeing each character and seeing their expressions and actions that they performed. It wasn't until I got older that I realized that the video montage of different scenes on top of Chris Redfield was very different than the rest, of course, just to censor the fact that he was smoking. And then after, of course, seeing Resident Evil with nothing else but explosions in the background,
Resident Evil,
then kind of made me think a little bit that, wow, this is very similar to when we were pressing the button earlier. It did kind of bring me out of it a little bit. At this point, I was thinking that, you know, the fear and terror is from the videos, and that was one thing, and I was looking forward to what was going to be next. And then we see the mansion hall, and if we're playing Chris, it's going to be Chris, Jill, and Wesker with their dialogue looking for Barry. And at the time, you feel very confident because it's the three of you right there in the mansion hall. And when you look at the mansion hall, it's very open, it's very clean, there's nothing that's actually wrong with it, so it's very disarming for you as a player, which I think was the intent for it. And they did a really good job making you feel confident because you had two others there in the mansion and you weren't going to go very far. And then, of course, you go into the next room, further separating it when you first run into the very first transition of a door opening, which is very intense, very disturbing for me as a child, and understandably so, as it brought a level of uncomfortableness to the player, knowing that you weren't quite sure what was behind that door. And then we're in the dining hall as Chris. We're looking at the start screen. You're looking at your items and understanding what it is that you need and what you have. Showing not very much in the sense of information other than you have a knife and a health unit, and you have no weapons. And of course, this in and of itself brought very much a little bit of confusion for me. Like, Chris had a gun in the FMV in the cutscene before. What happened to it? Why doesn't he have it now? Did he drop it? Did he run out of ammo or what? And, you know, in of itself was a little bit of confusion. And then, of course, getting used to these tank controls, which I, as a kid, didn't think they were too terrible and rough to figure out. And so I could walk pretty easily when it came to playing Resident Evil itself. The hardest part, actually, for me during the introduction was running. I had a hard time figuring out that if I held down the button and running into a certain direction, then I could run away. And I didn't feel like I could run away, which was part of the reason for the game design decision, was that in order to make it look like you're going to have a difficult time trying to run away from any. Looking at the dining hall itself, there's a lot of areas of interest, but nothing in the way of what could be given to you, what you could acquire, other than the fact it was just a disarming look that nothing was actually wrong with this mansion. And again, why you're here and what is actually lurking in the hallways and the places of the mansion. And then as we move further, the different type of camera view angles made it very interesting and actually frightening in the sense for anybody, as you weren't exactly sure what you were looking for and where. Checking the doors that they were locked down the hallway, you would then check the other way nonchalantly towards the end of the hallway until you turned around and saw the cutscene of the zombie killing and eating something. And at first, you didn't think it was a zombie, you just thought it was, okay, that's a person that obviously needed a shower. And then you look at his face and he's starting to eat human flesh. And it didn't really hit you too much until the actual zombie went and started eating you a little bit. And then at that time, you could either run or you could attack him with your knife. And I know in my first playthrough, I would die actually trying to attempt to kill the zombie with my knife, because I figured that I could do it a few times. And then eventually, when I knew it wasn't possible, I would run away thinking I need to find a weapon or something better. What was interesting about this section, though, is that seeing Kenneth with his head eaten off completely, it then finally kind of set in to say that something is really screwed up. There's flesh on and gore on the ground in the game that we're finally seeing, and this is confirmed that the fear and terror that we saw in the introduction is a real thing in this particular world. And there's going to be probably more of these things as we go further and further deeper into the mansion. With a false sense of security, of course, I ran back to the main hallway. And of course, the game in and of itself wanted you to be alone, as Jill and Wesker was not there. With the Where's Wesker theme that occurs because they're not there, further emphasizes the point that this is kind of a freaky game, and that you're just destined to be alone until you're not, and you're completed in this particular game itself. Feeling a little sense of relief that you're able to find Jill's gun. I will say, when I was seeing the text that was brought up for it, I was under the assumption and expectation that this is Jill's gun and not to fire as much bullets as possible, because you're looking to return this weapon to Jill when you run into her later. And of course that turns out very false, as it pretty much ends up being your weapon throughout the entire game. Future playthroughs, I would always end up picking Jill, mainly because a lot of times the strategy guide and everything would always indicate that Jill had the easiest method, where you would start out with a Beretta, you would start out with some bullets, and then of course you would have a lot more room in order to move around with, and that first zombie was easy to dispatch and take care of. In Jill's introduction, it's really nice because of the fact that you again get that false sense of security when you're there with Wesker and with Barry this time, looking for Chris. Going into the next room and then seeing Barry actually looking and investigating the blood splatter that is at the end of the room was a quite nice and confidence booster for Jill. Because Jill in and of itself, you were playing her as Jill, and me being as my first playthrough as a kid would feel a lot safer knowing that Barry was going to be there. Not to mention that when going through the same kind of intro sequence as Chris, playing Jill and seeing the zombie there and then running back, Barry, of course, dispatched and took care of the zombie, then I could go back and actually see Kenneth take the clips of the additional ammo after looking at Kenneth and his head kind of being ripped off and the gore and the blood. It just definitely level set it in even more, mainly because of the fact that there is blood and gore in this particular game, and killing and dying is very... Of course, the game throws another curveball in your false sense of security as you go back with Barry and go to report to Wesker, and of course, Wesker's gone with the same Where's Wesker theme. And you're thinking to yourself that, hey, Barry, maybe we'll stick together and we can go through this mansion together. It's going to be quite a much easier and better type of experience playing this game. And of course, your disappointment when you're playing through this, Barry, of course, does not join you. Instead, says, let's separate out and come back here later. And of course, when you leave as Jill into the other room, and let's say you go back to the last two rooms, Barry is nowhere to be seen. You truly, truly are alone. And it's a little bit of a buzzkill because you were just hoping that maybe we can go through this mansion together. And then, of course, my first playthrough as Jill, I would end up dying pretty easily as I would get eaten by a very iconic zombie that's lying on the floor in the little alcove next to the map room. And then finally, with the most nightmarish and fear-inducing sequence of the entire game of Cell, was the dogs jumping through the windows. I remember playing this particular hallway scene and being able to dispatch and take care of the first dog pretty easily, but the second dog I just could not get enough ability to actually aim and actually kill the dog before dying and being killed myself. Seeing the "you're dead" screen first few times is so uncomfortable, as it really shows that your work, your character that you made, is now dead and didn't even make it barely through the mansion. In order to get a bit more confidence to start this over again. But the interesting part is that this did allow some confidence for me to continue to play these games, Resident Evil in itself, many of times in the intro sequence, in order to actually, see these over and over again. But as soon as it got too intense, where you were kind of alone, then it just made it feel like it wasn't. The nice thing was, eventually, as I went through those, I did actually grab a nightmare from seeing the death of Jill and these particular dogs jumping through the windows that they did, as well as the crunching sound of Joseph in the beginning FMV, that it instilled a motivation in me in order to know that in order for me to not have these nightmares going forward, I would need to complete Resident Evil, complete the game, and just kind of see the resolution of surviving whatever it was at the end of the particular game. Once that was done, which took pretty much an entire weekend for me to do so, I was able to sleep soundly without any issues. But even after completing the particular game, the one thing that always kept in my mind and echoed there, even to this day, is whenever I hear the PlayStation theme sound and, of course, the Capcom intros. The second portion, the director's cut when it was released, as well as the DualShock, the Capcom intro was also changed slightly more, and in my opinion was even more disturbing and scary. When it kind of made more of a blocks kind of creating the Capcom logo and the chimes and chongs and things that were involved with the music that just kind of echoed a little bit further in my mind than the original one. The original one had a bit more of a confidence and lighthearted feel, but the director's cut version of the Capcom logo, which I mean is in other games, but Capcom in and of itself for me was pretty much Resident Evil. Anytime I would hear that chime or anything, I would get a level of anxiety because I kind of knew that it was either going to be a Resident Evil game or another game from Capcom. And most of my friends and anybody that I conversed with had Resident Evil and the Resident Evil Director's Cut. The anxiety also of the PlayStation theme stuck with me as well, as I knew that it was building up with bass, and then at the echo portion of it, that the Capcom theme and introduction might come afterwards and cause even more anxiety to know that Resident Evil is back, and I may have to play it to complete it again. So this in and of itself has more of a personal touch and a level of immersion that I can only express through these discussions and thoughts. And this is also why, in my opinion, being a kid, 11, 12, 13 years old, into adulthood that I am now, that Resident Evil, the original version as well as the director's cut, has the best level of introduction immersion for fear and terror in the world of survival horror. Not only did we feel that this was the first when it came to survival horror for zombies, but in my mind it was 4 to 5 levels of immersion that has never left me in my head when knowing that Resident Evil is being played on the PlayStation.